Welcome back to the channel, everybody. Hope everyone's having a great day. Today in Chicago, it's about -8 degrees. And although it's sunny, I can't help but think of opening day coming up the next few months and the opening of spring training at the end of next month. So on this day, a day that I also have off from work, I took the opportunity to be able to kind of pull out one of my old programs from a game that I attended when I was a child. This was my very first White Sox game back in 1986, when my dad took me to go see my favorite player at the time, which was Cal Ripken, play the Chicago White Sox at Old Comiskey Park. I haven't looked at this program probably since my childhood, and I had forgotten much of its contents. And I will say now, with the perspective of time and the knowledge of baseball history, I have found it to be a very rewarding experience kind of going back through the program. And I wanted to be able to kind of share the contents of it with you now and maybe pull out some cards that kind of fit with it. So I hope you enjoy. So the first thing I noticed was I've opened up to the middle of the magazine. In here, I was able to get a copy of the actual roster for the game that day. What I thought was pretty interesting at the time is I thought this was a gift for my birthday. So my birthday is actually at the end of May, and I thought we went to the game in May. But as I found out pretty quickly, this game was actually held on July 9th, 1986. Which was different than what I thought before. So when I kind of look at some of the players on the rosters here, it's a little different than what I thought it might be based on what was on the roster for the Chicago White Sox that season. One of the things you'll notice for that season is Tom Seaver actually was listed in here as still being on the White Sox, which was true at the beginning of the 1986 season. At some point during this season, he was actually moved on to Boston, where he finished his career and appeared with the Boston Red Sox as they tried to be able to make their way to the World Series, which they did, and as we know how that kind of ended. But other players that were featured on the White Sox of this year is we have Carlton Fisk, obviously, being a big feature of that team. We also had Tony La Russa, who was still the manager at the beginning of the season, although that didn't necessarily last for the entirety of the season. At some point during that season, Steve Carlton actually even came over to the White Sox and was brought over via trade. He's not, at this point on July 9th of that season, it hadn't happened yet, but he was definitely on his way. And then we have obviously everybody's favorite player, Harold Baines, favorite Hall of Famer, was also probably the biggest star in that team. But as I mentioned, the player that I really wanted to see was my favorite player at the time, which was Cal Ripken. And of course, he was in the lineup at that time. Didn't take a day off for many years to come. And some other players that I noted were on that roster at that time, when I kind of look at the back, and also coaches that are of kind of significance, is obviously we have Eddie Murray too. A player I don't have like a necessarily standalone player card for him, but also one of the coaches was Frank Robinson on the staff at that time, as well as Cal Ripken Sr. at that point. We also had Elrod Hendricks, who was a pretty famous player during the Baltimore Orioles of the late 1960s and early 70s. And as far as the coaching staff at this point, they had already let go of Tony La Russa, and Jim Fregosi was managing the White Sox at this point. And this is obviously a few years before he managed the 1993 Phillies into the World Series. So that was kind of the first thing I kind of noted, was how my memory kind of slipped a little bit. And I realized this game actually was held in July as opposed to May, which I had always thought up until this point. One of the first things I noticed was an article on Ken Hawk Harrelson. Ken Hawk Harrelson was the broadcaster for the White Sox for many years and actually went on to have a Hall of Fame broadcast career for the White Sox. At this time, though, he was just brought in as the Executive Vice President of Baseball Operations, a position which he held very shortly for the White Sox. As you can see, he's pictured here with a cowboy hat, which I think was his official photo for the White Sox yearbook that year. But as you can see, he's actually pictured in the background here back during his playing days when he played briefly with Cleveland towards the end of his career. He had a long career with the Kansas City A's, but then came over and probably was most famous for being on the 1967 Boston Red Sox and had his best seasons with them at that time. So there's definitely a little article on there, but what he's probably most famous for was actually letting this guy go. Letting Tony La Russa go at that point because the White Sox were not off to their best start at that point. And as we know, Tony La Russa then went on to sign with the Oakland Athletics shortly thereafter, and the rest is kind of history in his Hall of Fame managing career. At some point before the publication of the White Sox yearbook for this season, their longtime executive and owner, Bill Veeck, had passed away. Bill Veeck obviously was a lifer in baseball, starting his career early with the Chicago Cubs before moving on into ownership and management with then the Cleveland Indians, and then he moved on to the St. Louis Browns and was part of the transition of them moving to Baltimore, although he wasn't with Baltimore by the time they actually played their first game there in the 1954 season. After that, he kind of bounced around baseball a little bit before he was actually able to buy into ownership for the White Sox. He was kind of known for bringing a lot of promotions into baseball games from the very onset of him being involved with baseball operations. Obviously, Eddie Gaedel probably being the one that's most noted for the St. Louis Browns. But sometimes people forget he's actually the owner, who was responsible for bringing the first African-American player into the American League, and that would be Larry Doby. Larry Doby, during his time, obviously played briefly with the White Sox as a player, but he also came back to be their manager shortly in the late 1970s. So Larry Doby remained somewhat affiliated with the White Sox thereafter, due large in part because of his relationship with Bill Veeck. I stumbled upon this article in here, which was celebrating the 50th anniversary at that time of Luke Appling batting .388 to lead the league in hitting in 1936. He didn't win the MVP that year, and it was his first of 2 batting titles. But at that point, they kind of within this article, they chronicled almost month by month however they were in the standings, and talked to some of the players that played with him at that time, such as in here they also kind of have an opportunity to be able to kind of talk to Jimmy Dykes, who was a player who played with him on that team. What was kind of interesting as you went through it is here's a picture of him kind of featured now, right before he actually passed away a few years later. Was that they obviously talked a lot about his 1936 season, which kind of made me think of the 1936 Diamond Star card. And I wondered how many young boys who were White Sox fans at that time tried to be able to get this card, because he was moving on and trying to chase those of Earl Averill and Lou Gehrig to be able to win the batting title. So it was pretty interesting getting an opportunity to kind of read this article and kind of think about, if I was a kid at that time, I would probably try and pick up this card, knowing that Luke Appling was one of the best hitters in the game at that moment. It also mentioned shortly there towards the end that he had an opportunity to be able to go against a 17-year-old Bob Feller, who was a rookie at that time in 1936. He dominated the White Sox on the mound that day, but Luke Appling was not one of his victims. Luke Appling actually did pretty well against him that day, although he definitely took down, I think, 10 White Sox at that time, struck out 10 White Sox during that game when they played. This article was fun to have an opportunity to look at because they are celebrating the history of White Sox shortstops at that point. This was coming off the 1985 season in which Ozzie Guillen, here pictured managing the White Sox many years later, won the Rookie of the Year. So obviously it kind of talks a little bit about the history of the players that played that position, many of which actually were featured or actually members of the Hall of Fame, such as George Davis, Luke Appling, as we talked about earlier, Luis Aparicio. But it also mentioned those like Chico Carousel, mentioned on there, as well as George Buck Weaver, who's part of the Chicago White Sox during the 1919 World Series, in which he was banned along with several other players. And so he's never going to be eligible for the Hall of Fame, but he's part of the Black Sox scandal from that season. Most fans know that the Chicago White Sox were the ones that hosted the very first All-Star Game in 1933. This was due in large part because the World's Fair was actually being held in Chicago during 1933, and this was an opportunity to be able to showcase baseball. In here, I like to kind of see who are some of the early All-Stars for the White Sox. And as I kind of mentioned before in previous videos, I was trying to be able to pick up the cards of those All-Stars from those first 2 appearances, in which we had Jimmy Dykes being one of the All-Stars featured here in his Diamond Star cards, as well as a card I picked up this summer, which was Al Simmons, who came over from Philadelphia for a couple seasons and was an All-Star for 3 straight years for them. So that's kind of in addition to kind of seeing other players that were able to make the All-Star game over the years, such as a Luke Appling and also a Ted Lyons, as we kind of mentioned here earlier, all of which kind of fit into my collection of Diamond Star cards. and also of Hall of Fame players from the 1930s and early 40s for the Chicago White Sox. This page was a little bit fun to get a chance to look at. This was through, obviously, the 1985 season, but it had this single season leaders in many statistical categories for the Chicago White Sox. So in addition, you have Luke Appling that was featured on here. You have several other Hall of Famers that were mentioned on here too, including Eddie Collins, who spent a large majority of his career with the White Sox, although he's often thought of as being a Philadelphia A, rightfully so, as he was able to have many of his best seasons with them, but he actually spent more time with the White Sox than he did with any other franchise. Another player that was of interest at that time was Zeke Bondura, as I've kind of featured before here on the channel, as he was like our single season RBI leader and home run leader for many, many years before that was broke. But has an opportunity to kind of see some other Hall of Famers for the White Sox that are kind of featured here, such as like Nellie Fox was kind of featured on here before, Luis Aparicio, as we kind of mentioned earlier, as well as Minnie Minoso, all of which are kind of big names in White Sox lore up through this period in the early 80s. And to parallel the single season hitting leaders, we also have the single season pitching leaders as well. So within here you see some other Hall of Fame names that are kind of mentioned, including Early Wynn, a pitcher who obviously won the Cy Young Award with the White Sox in 1959. Wilbur Wood, a pitcher that was pretty famous with the White Sox through the late 60s and early 70s. Not a Hall of Famer, but had a very good career. As we mentioned earlier, we see obviously Ted Lyons mentioned several times, but we also see Urban Red Faber, who actually was a member of the 17 World Championship team, was a part of the 1919 season team as well, but actually he was on the injured list by the time they reached the World Series, so he wasn't involved with the White Sox scandal, but spent the rest of his career with the White Sox dealing with the aftermath of that and being on some pretty bad teams. We also saw Billy Pierce, who was their best pitcher during the 1950s and maybe one of the best pitchers of that era period. And then obviously probably the one that kind of shadows or overshadows them all, which would be Ed Walsh, pictured here on the 1911 double Mecca folder. We will actually talk a little bit more about Ed later on during this magazine when he's actually featured. Tucked up in this corner here, they actually have the Sox Award winners. At this point, they hadn't won a lot of awards. In fact, there was only 2 MVPs in their history at this point, one of which being Nelson Fox, who was the 1959 American League MVP at that point. Since then, they've been able to pick up 2 more, so they have 4 in their histories. I kind of talk about the rookies of the year, such as Luis Aparicio, because I kind of mentioned earlier, as well as Ozzie Guillen. But then they also had some of the Gold Glove Cy Young Award winners, as we kind of mentioned, Early Wynn being one of them, Lamar Hoyt another, who passed away recently. Then we have some of the Gold Glove Award winners, including like players such as Minnie Minoso, as well as Jim Kaat, who pitched briefly for the White Sox during the 1970s and was able to pick up a couple of Gold Glove awards himself. There was a brief article about the 80-year anniversary of the very first Chicago White Sox World Series team. In fact, this was the first Chicago team of any kind to be able to win the World Series. In 1906, they were known as the Hitless Wonders and went up against the Chicago Cubs, who were heavily favored to be able to win the World Series, only to go ahead and upset them. And throughout this article, they kind of talk about the players that were on this team that kind of played above their pay grade at that point, hit above their weight, if you will, when they got to the World Series, but that it was really the pitching that was really kind of leading the way during this World Series, and talks mostly about a player such as Ed Walsh, pictured here along with his card as well, who actually dominated the team. In fact, Ed Walsh was a very dominant pitcher during this time and still has the career lowest ERA of any pitcher. Although at some point people kind of question that a little bit now because he did not have a very lengthy career, and it was during the dead ball era. But during his time, he was right up there with Christy Mathewson and Walter Johnson as being one of the best pitchers in baseball. And during this season, he actually led them to the World Series, and later on he was able to be the last pitcher to win 40 games in a single season. And the final thing I wanted to share with you that was of note, at this time the White Sox had not been in the postseason very often. In fact, they only had 6 appearances and had won only 2 World Series, being the first 2 that they played in, had lost subsequently thereafter. Obviously this features what the results were for each and every game, and it talked about who the winning and losing pitcher was. And here you see obviously Ed Welsh mentioned again for his appearances in the 1906 World Series. And in 1917, it kind of talks about Red Faber being able to pick up 3 victories, or pitched in 3 different games during that time, and actually was the winner in 3 of the games during that World Series. In 1919, talks a little bit about, obviously, the results of that one, which was the 9-game World Series, and we have Ray Schalk, who was the catcher for that team and Hall of Fame catcher as well. But then by that point, they didn't have another World Series appearance until 1959 when they were led to the World Series by Al Lopez. The manager obviously came over from the Cleveland Indians at that point and lost to the Dodgers, who at that point won their very first World Series, being the Los Angeles Dodgers. And then finally, 83 was a very recent memory at the time in 1986 in which they appeared in the playoffs in the American League Championship Series, only to lose to Cal Ripken and the Baltimore Orioles. So this was an exercise in just kind of seeing how one single magazine kind of brings it all together for me. This was not something I was familiar with when I read this magazine for the very first time in 1950 or 1986. And I wouldn't have been able to anticipate owning so many different cards at that time from players throughout these eras in White Sox history. So I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I hope you guys have a wonderful week, are able to stay warm if you're in parts of the north that are in this desperately cold period of time here in January. But I look forward to be able to put a video out pretty soon of some new recent pickups that I'm looking forward to be able to share with you, and I'll be back soon. Have a great week.